My name's Russ Warmack. I was born in Pueblo, Colorado on July 31st, 1927. I went to school in Pueblo and I lived there all my life until I went into the service. I was sitting at home. I can't remember exactly what we were doing, but in those days we didn't have TV and listened to the radio. It was Sunday morning and we were just kind of, doing what people naturally do. And all of a sudden, this came on the news. And I can remember going down to the corner, and they already had the extra papers out from the old Pueblo Star Journal and Chieftain, and that was the first time we heard about it. And of course, it was a big thing in those days, and we were just all pretty much shocked about the whole thing. Back in those days, we didn't get very far from home, and the Pearl Harbor was a long way off, and the only thing we could do was look at the mountains, and we'd say, "Man, it's somewhere over those mountains." And of course, all of us, we were old enough. I was a freshman in high school at the time, and the only thing we could think of was, gee, we wish we were old enough that we could go over there and do something about this. But the nice thing about it was the 4 years I was in high school was the 4 years of the war, 41 through 45. And we did a lot of things. We had scrap drives, paper drives, and we used to take our dimes to school every week, and we would buy a stamp, and when we got enough stamps in there, we had an 1875 war bond. But we had to sit, and watch this. We were all listening to the news, and I can remember my folks kept all of the newspapers with, all of the events that were going on around the world at that time. It was quite an interesting time. The only way we could keep up with it was through the newspaper and the radio. But one of the things that we did quite a bit of in those days was we went to the movies, and it was they always had the newsreels, and we could see what was going on. That was really the only way we ever saw what was going on, just through the movie newsreels. But that was probably the only form of entertainment. Back in those days, you could go to a movie for 15 cents, and if you had a quarter, you could get a candy bar and a bag of popcorn. So we did that quite frequently. And that was about the only entertainment we had in those days. Of course, you couldn't get gasoline. You had ration stamps, and you couldn't get sugar and those kinds of things. And I can remember the speed limit was only 35 miles an hour, and most of the highways were still gravel. They weren't paved back in those days. But it was a great time because everybody came together. It's amazing. You go your own way, and then when you have a catastrophe like this, they come together and they just do things that normally they wouldn't do. So it was a tough time, but it was a good time. We were in school. We could hardly wait till we were old enough to get into the service and get it. That was the thing to do, and everybody wanted to go. I don't know whether you'd call it patriotism or what, but as I mentioned earlier, we graduated on a Friday in June, and the following Monday there was a whole bunch of us were down at the recruiting office, and we joined the Navy, and that was on June the 7th, 1945. And we were veterans of World War II, but while we were still in boot camp, the war was over in Japan. I think it was over in August of 1945. Thinking back, I can't think of anyone that really didn't want to get going, get into the thing. A lot of the classmates I had enough credits that they were able to graduate at the half, which was, I think, in January. And when I went to boot camp, and when I started boot camp in San Diego, they were just finishing. But I can't think of anyone that really tried to, that was concerned about going into the service. And I have a high school annual, and it has all of the graduates from my old high school in Pueblo, which is Pueblo Central High School, that lost their lives. There's quite a few of them that were out there, and the majority of them were either in the Navy or the Marine Corps. And it was just something we wanted to do. We had to do. We had to do this, and so I can't think of too many. Most of the people that didn't go into the service were 4F, and they physically weren't able to for some reason or other. I think we were all a little bit naive about it. It was a thing to do, and we didn't really know too much about what was going on over there. But most of the people that were in my class in high school, they were back before I was. Most of them were probably 18 when they went in, and they went in as a reserve, and they came back, and they didn't spend the 3 years in like I did. But I find that very few of them ever talk about it. You know, if they ask if you were in the service, yeah, I was in the Navy or whatever, and you know, that's about the extent of it. But I found very few, and I think it's pretty much that way with most of the veterans in World War II. They don't talk too much about what they did or what they saw or these kinds of things. You know, I lived at home, and your folks always took care of you and all of that sort of stuff, and all of a sudden you're in a completely different environment, you know. I can remember when I first got off the bus in San Diego at the Naval Training Station, the first thing they did was they run us to the barber shop. And, you know, most high school kids are pretty vain. You know, in those days I had hair, actually. And the last thing you wanted was a bald head. And they sat you down in a barber chair, and they took it all off. And the funny thing was, one of the old salts told us, put a quarter on the top of your head, and they won't cut all your hair off. So we all did that, and the barbers took the quarters, and they still cut it all off. But those were tough times. I think we learned discipline. In those days, if somebody that was a higher rank than you, you know, said to hop up and down, you hopped up and down. There was no question to it. And it taught most of us to get out and do things on our own. We didn't have to rely on anybody. And for that, I'm thankful, because I've never had to rely on anybody very much anyway, the rest of my life. And I think that was probably the biggest thing I learned, was discipline and to take care of myself. Well, I went to the Naval Training Center in San Diego, boot camp. And as I mentioned, I was 17 when I went in, and my folks had to sign a release to let me go in. But I went in on a minority cruise, and that minority cruise was the regular Navy. It was not the reserves, which meant that I was in until I was 21. So I was in the Navy just a few months over 3 years. Well, a minority cruise is for anyone that's under 18 years old. In other words, you still aren't in a position where you can make decisions for yourself. So like I mentioned, my father had to sign for me to go into the Navy. And when you do that, you can only be in the service until you're 21. On your 21st birthday, you're discharged. So that's what I went in on, was a minority cruise. And I was about 2 months, you know, prior to my 18th birthday. So I did that, and you know, I always wanted to be in the Navy. You know, I always wanted to go to China, but I never quite got there. I only got as far as the Marianas Islands. But if I had been on my own and made my own decision, I probably would have signed up for a 20-year hitch right off. And so, minority cruise, you have to have your parents sign, and then you can only go in until you're 21. After boot camp, fortunately, being in the regular Navy, I was able to choose whatever kind of work I wanted to do in the Navy, and I'd always been kind of interested in radio, so I applied for that, and I got it. And they sent me from San Diego to Bainbridge, Maryland, which was a training facility. And when I completed that, then I went from Bainbridge, Maryland to Bainbridge Island, which is up in Seattle. It's out in the Puget Sound, for some advanced training. And then upon the completion of that, I was sent out into the regular Navy duties. When I went from boot camp in San Diego to Bainbridge, Maryland for training, I went on a troop sleeper. And that was an interesting thing, because a lot of the people that were on this troop sleeper were veterans that were coming back from the South Pacific that were going home. I mean, they were being discharged and they were on their way home. And my first station was in Adak, Alaska, which is way out in the end of the Aleutians. It's almost in Siberia. Up in Adak, when I was up there first, I can remember there was a bomber that had crashed into the mountain behind us, and we used to hike up there and you know, explore the bomber and the mountains and everything. And the other island that was further out from us was the one that was actually inhabited by the Japanese during the war. And when I got there, of course, you know, this was all over and done with. The only action I ever saw was when I was in Adak, and there was another island out there called Sitka. They had a mountain on it, Mount Sitkan, and it was a great big old mountain. It had snow on it and cloud. You could see it way off in the distance. I don't know how far it was, but that was an active volcano, and they had earthquakes up there. And I can remember one night I was on watch, and I was working in a teletype room, and we had these big radio transmitters that went, almost as high as the ceiling here. And they're all back against the wall, and I was sitting there, and you feel kind of dizzy, and I looked up, and there's those, they were just going like this, and we had a earthquake out there, and it split the whole end it was a Quonset hut, and it split the whole end of the Quonset hut. And like I said, that's the only action I can ever remember being in that it was kind of scary. But when you get up there, it's kind of primitive. Like I said, you get out on Adak, and that's almost like being in Siberia. It's just a short hop and a jump, and you're in Siberia. But strange things happen out there, and that old volcano. We could see the old smoke coming up, and then we'd get those little shakes every now and then. But this one was a big one, and it just ripped the end of that Quonset hut up. And another thing that was interesting up there, we had these great big, actually were 50-gallon oil drums. We had one on each end of the Quonset hut, and we had a stove on each end of the Quonset hut. And like I mentioned, it would get cold up there. Boy, it would really get cold. And every time those things would run out, we always had a spare can there. They'd run out like 2 o'clock in the morning when everybody's sound asleep. And we'd be out there, all the nuts and bolts were frozen to start with. We were trying to get that thing off so we'd get another barrel of oil on there to heat the stove up. Fortunately, I don't remember both of them at each end of the hut going out at the same time. But, it was really a lot of fun. It was an experience that you have to do in order to really realize what was going on there. And then we had what we call willowaws, where the wind would blow, and we had these little wooden walks that would go up. You'd come out of your Quonset hut, and then you'd take this. We had a rope around there. We'd hold that rope, and we'd get up to the chow hall or to the next Quonset hut or up to the watch station. And this wind would blow so bad that, it would actually blow you off the walk. And if you ever got out there in a tundra or something, you'd probably never find your way back. But it was really something to do those things. And we had a Quonset hut where the showers and the toilet and all that was. And boy, you ought to see the guys how fast they could go from the Quonset hut to take a shower and get back, because you freeze to death before you got back. It was really great. I can remember also we used to go down. They had a stream, and the salmon used to go back up in the mountain, and they'd spawn. And we could go down to these streams, and the salmon, salmon like this. And they would get on these little sandbanks where the water wasn't very deep, and on their stomach, and they'd get to the next deep water, and then they'd swim. And we'd go down and catch them on a sandbank, just throw them out on a bank, and we'd take them down to the chow hall. And the cook, for half the salmon, he'd fix the salmon for us. And, it was either that or dehydrated potatoes and dehydrated milk and those dehydrated eggs they used to have, this sort of stuff. And that was a real treat. But there were just things up there that were just so different that it was an experience in itself. In the springtime, it gets up probably in the 70s or 80 degrees. We had a place called Clam Lagoon, and it was just kind of a lagoon in there. And the guys would actually go down and go swimming in that. I went up there in, let's see, when did I go? I went up probably in September, and I was up there through the winter. And the guys would actually go down there and swim in it. The water was cold, man. It was cold, but they could go down actually and go swimming in it. And then we had the tundra. It was nothing but it was like a big haystack. And we used to go up to the top, and I mentioned there was a bomber that had crashed in the mountain up there. We'd go up to that thing, and we could come down that thing. We could take a run and just fly in the air and just roll down that, all the way down that thing. It was just like just a big old haystack is what it was like. And we had a bunch of little foxes that they burrowed under the Quonset hut. And another thing, we used to buy Coke in those big bottles. I think there was 36 bottles in a box. And we could get them at the PX, and we put those things under our Quonset hut, and sometimes they would be slushy when you tried to drink them. And this, not Quonset hut, but under our bunk. And we had these big fur-lined parkas with the top on it, and they go clear down to your ankles. And a lot of times the guys would sleep in those. You'd get under your blankets and wear that parka, and boy, I'll tell you, wild. I don't recall doing a lot of reading. I read a lot today. I buy books from Amazon. As a matter of fact, I just got the latest Pearl Harbor book from them yesterday. But the USO used to send up books to us, paperbacks, and these would be in great big boxes, bigger than a coffin. And they would bring those up, and they would put them in our rec hall. And we had a little rec hall where we could show movies, you know, and they had a pool table and a ping pong table in there. And we'd go down, and we'd all get a big armload of those darn paperback books, and we'd take them back, and we'd read them, and then we'd swap. You know, that'd keep you could read them for a year up there. And I really got into reading books that way. And, you know, there wasn't anything else to do. You know, when it was snowing and blowing outside, you were inside, and that was about the extent of it. So we used to get that, and then once in a while we'd get somebody from the movie industry would come around, and most of them were B-type actors or something, you know, that you really didn't notice or didn't know, but they were pretty good. They were pretty funny. Most of my group got back to the receiving station in Seattle before I did, because we had a big snowstorm, as I recall, and we couldn't get out. There's no way you could get back. So anyway, when I got back, they had already left, and they went back on a net tender. I don't know, a net tender is not much bigger than a yacht, you know. But anyway, when I got back, there were 6 of us, and we got to fly up. And I can't remember, there was an admiral that was making an inspection tour. I can't remember who it was. He was probably a rear admiral, one of the one-star jobbers. But anyway, they used to have these big C-57 or C-54 Navy planes, you know, the big ones. Anyway, he was on that, and we got to fly up with him. So we got to fly from the Naval Air Station in Seattle to Fairbanks, Alaska. And the night we were in Fairbanks, Alaska, mind you, 75 degrees below zero. They had to take little, like, tents out over the engines of the airplanes with burners down there to keep them from freezing up. But anyway, we got to fly to Fairbanks, and then we got to come back, and we went to Dutch Harbor, and we went to Kodiak Island, and then we flew from there on out to Adak. And Adak is the second island from the end of the Aleutians. It's way, way out there. And, you know, we got a tour of Alaska, you know, but it was in the middle of the wintertime, and it's colder than heck up there. But anyway, it was quite interesting. And the places, you know, I never would have gotten to otherwise. We flew by Mount McKinley. McKinley's the one in Alaska, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, we were flying, and I don't know what the altitude was, but we had to look up to see the top of the darn thing as we went by there. And we saw lakes and rivers and streams down there I know no one had ever fished in before. And just, man, to get down there with a fly rod or, you know, something, it just tear you up. I imagine now there's a lot of people up there, and it's not like that anymore. But that was an interesting thing. I thought, going to Adak, you know, who wants to go to Adak, Alaska? But it was an experience that I wouldn't trade for anything. And, you know, we used to tromp across the tundra to a place called 20th Air Force, and the 20th Air Force had already left. They had abandoned this. And we used to go in and chip ice off of the floor because the windows were kind of broken in this great big Quonset hut. And it was a basketball court. And we used to go up there and play basketball. You know, it was just really something else. A lot of fun. And I spent about 9 months out there, and there's some pretty tough weather where the wind blew all the time. It wasn't much snow, but it was colder than all get out. And from there I came back. I came home. I had a 30-day leave, and I went back to San Francisco, and I boarded a ship and went to the Marianas Islands. And I spent the next 14 months on the island of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. And all of those times I was a communications technician, and I spent most of my times in radio communications. I learned to send and receive the Morse code and all of that sort of stuff. And that was basically about what I did in the service. When I got to the Marianas Islands, it was starting to build up. They had the naval government was running the island, and you could still see a lot of the ships and the weapons carriers and these sorts of things that were laying around that had been destroyed during the war. And of course, when the Navy came in with the bombardment, they leveled most of the coconut trees and everything on the island. It was pretty primitive in those days, but it was starting to build up. Of course, that was a couple of years after the war was over, and I never saw any, but I was still told that there were still Japanese on the island that were holding out, and I guess that was true in most of the islands in the Pacific. I had to tell from some of the old people that had been there for a while that we used to have a place out in the boondocks, out in the middle of the jungle, where they cleared it away, and we had what was equivalent to a drive-in movie theater. And they had the big screen, and we had the benches, and the guys would go down in the evening and watch a movie. And I was told on numerous occasions the Japanese would sneak down at night, and they would be sitting on the benches watching the movie with the rest of us, and then they would, when it was over, they'd back into the jungle. I never saw any of this, and what I'm saying is just strictly hearsay, but those were kind of interesting times, and it was kind of scary at times because our radio station was right out in the middle of a little clearing in the middle of a jungle, and we'd drive out in a weapons carrier, and we had a big barbed wire fence around it to keep everybody out. I never saw any Japanese, but I was told that there were still some on there. And I think I read later that one of them was on one of the islands for something like 40 years after the war was over, and he didn't even know the war was over. And finally they caught him and sent him home, I guess. Well, I think some of them were pretty much isolated, and they really didn't, and there were a lot of caves on the island. The island of Guam, as I remember, was about 35 miles long and about, I don't know, 8 or 10 miles wide. So it was a pretty large island. So it's possible. One end of it was high cliffs and everything, and I'm sure that they could probably have hidden out there for a long time. The outfit I was in was communications, and not too many of them ever saw that type of action. But there were a lot of Air Force people there. They had the B-29s on the island, and they had a lot of Navy and Marine personnel there. But I'm sure that there were a lot of them that were, in combat somewhere along there, but I never got too much in contact with them. Most of the people I was with, as I mentioned, were behind the lines and sitting in a nice, comfortable radio shack doing those kinds of things. Bananas. We used to get bananas and put them in our hot lockers. And out there, we lived in Quonset huts, and in order to keep your clothes and everything from mildewing, we had an electrical arrangement where we had a light bulb in each of those, our lockers, and we would put our clothes in there, and it would keep them from, getting mildewed and all that sort of stuff. And it was real interesting because we had the nets over our bunks, and we had double bunks, and we had to have the nets over our bunks. One reason was mosquitoes, and the other was lizards. And we just had these little lizards. They were, I don't know what they call them exactly, but they were kind of transparent. You could almost see through them. And they would crawl all over the top of that net at night. And you'd sit there, and when I first got there, it just bothered the heck out of me, because, what am I going to do if one of those things drops down into the bunk? But they never did. But they used to get in our hot lockers, and we used to bring, if we had the night watch, we would get all of the cookies and cake or whatever was left over from the chow hall, and we would take it up and we would have it with our coffee during the night watch. And if we put that in our hot locker before we went up there, the little lizards would get in and they would start chomping away on it. So we had to be a little careful about that. Even at that, it was pretty destructive. I can remember when I was on Guam seeing some of these ships with the superstructure still, sticking up out of the water. And most of them, I think, were Japanese ships, but you could go down on the beach and you could find the landing craft, that the Marines and everything came in. Some of those things were still rusting away on the beaches there. And it was tough. And I don't think you're going to find too many people that just want to sit down and talk about that. I think from what little I've heard, it was pretty gruesome. And, I don't know that they would really like to talk about those things too much. I mean, there's a lot of things where maybe it wasn't quite that bad that, they would talk about. But I don't think anybody is ever going to really know, what some of the veterans went through, both in Europe and in the South Pacific. It was just, it was horrible. I mean, when I was there, I can, just from being there, I can see the kinds of problems that they would have had, when they tried to come in and take the island back. It wasn't an easy chore. They were just dug in, and there was just no way you could do that very easily. Fortunately, you know, with the big battleships and everything sitting out there bombarding everything. But even at that, they were still dug in. And, you know, you had to dig them out, and it was really tough. And the ones that really caught it were the Marine Corps. You know, they had to go in and do this. It's kind of nice being in the Navy because we could sit out, you know, several miles and blast away at them. My understanding is when I was on Guam, for every palm tree that was destroyed by the Navy gunfire, the Guamanians were compensated for that. And it was kind of funny in one way because they lived in these little huts up on kind of on stilts, and then underneath each one you'd see a big old Chrysler or Cadillac or something. You know, it's where they spent their money. You know, some of the bombers that went on that left from the airfield in Guam, on Guam. And when I was on Guam, they had so many B-29s that I was told, now I don't know whether this is so or not, that each crew would fly a different B-29 every time they went up to get the hours on the airplanes. And I had never heard much about, you know, the atomic bomb after that was over. There wasn't too much. But there was one thing that was kind of interesting. When I was in Pearl Harbor, you know, our ship stopped there for a while, off in the distance. And I think I got a picture of it there somewhere. There was the USS battleship Nevada, and it was painted orange, completely orange. And this is one of the battleships that was obsolete, and I guess it was decommissioned and everything. And they hauled it down, and I don't remember whether they took it to the island of Bikini or Eniwetok, where they dropped the atom bomb. And this was part of the thing that they dropped the bomb on there. But it was quite interesting. You know, you went through there and you see this great big battleship out there, all painted. I guess they painted it orange so they wouldn't miss it for some reason. But that was quite interesting. When I was in Pearl Harbor also, you know, the Arizona was there and the superstructure was still up. They hadn't, you know, done anything with that yet. But I never heard anything. No one said very much about the bomb. And so I don't know. You know, even though the war was over at that time, the patriotism was still pretty strong. I mean, we looked after each other. And I'd sure like to see it go back that way again. I was discharged in San Francisco on July 31st, 1948. Back in those days, my dad worked for the CF&I steel mill down in Pueblo, and I don't think he made over maybe $4,000, $4,500 a year. You know, that was good money back in, you know, in the 30s and the 40s. But there was no way that they could afford to send me to school unless I, you know, worked my way through. And I'm not sure whether I would have done that or not. But anyway, when I got out, I immediately went out over to, we had a junior college in Pueblo Junior College. It's now the University of Southern Colorado. But I went there and went to school there for 3 years or 2 years and got my Associate of Science degree. You know, that was GI Bill, took care of that. And then from there, one of the things I found out is if you were in the service and you went to work for a government organization, your service time counted on your seniority. So one of the profs I had down there was a good friend of mine, and he was also a Navy vet. But anyway, he got me an interview with the old CAA, which is a Federal Aviation Agency today. And I got a job with them as an air route traffic controller in a control tower at the Lincoln Airport in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it worked out pretty well because I had 3 years, you know, seniority over a lot of people. I can remember one time when I was working in Lincoln, Nebraska, you know, in the control tower, we also did the weather watch. And I can remember the planes used to come in from United Airlines and they would spend the night in Lincoln, Nebraska, and then they'd leave the next morning. And one night, one of these planes came in and it had Bob Hope, Jerry Colonna, Marilyn Maxwell. I can't remember who else, but there was the whole troop that used to go, you know, to the USO. And we had a little plot of grass out outside from where the terminal was, and then the airplane was parked over there. And I can remember Bob Hope had a bucket of golf balls, and he was out there pitching golf balls over the airplane over onto the tarmac. And it was just really quite interesting. Met some of the greatest people. But eventually all of these guys that were in the Air Force started coming out, and they had some of them, 10, 12 years in the Air Force, and they came to work, and all of a sudden I'm the low man on the totem pole. So they offered to offer me another position, like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Cleveland, Ohio, and Lincoln, Nebraska was too far east for me as it was. So I just resigned and came back, and fortunately Mountain Bell Telephone was hiring people at the time. So I went down and hired on as a lineman, and I used to go out and dig poles and plant telephone poles, and then I would climb and string the wire and a cable, and wound up working for them for 35 years. I started with the Mountain Bell Telephone in 1952 down in Pueblo, and during the war, the government took over the communications industry. They run Mountain Bell Telephone, Mountain States Telephone and Telegraph, and all of the others, and then they turned them back over after the war was over. So anyway, they had all of these orders, back orders, people wanting telephone service, and after the war, everything was just a big boom. So anyway, I went to work for them in the construction department, and like I said, I went out and dug holes, and we planted telephone poles, and we did all of this sort of stuff. I did that for about 5 months, and I happened to have had a first-class radio telephone license, which permitted me to, operate a radio station or a TV station or whatever. So after about 5 months outside, I came inside, and I worked on the test board and the long distance toll test board as a central office repairman. And I worked in Pueblo a few years, and then I went to Alamosa, and I spent 5 years in Alamosa doing the same kind of work. And then I got a promotion from there into management and came to Denver, and that was in August of 1959. And I lived in Lakewood for a few months, and then we bought a home here in Broomfield in 1960. And I worked for Mountain Bell for 30 years, and the last 5 years I worked for AT&T. And that was just, I went over to them just prior to the breakup of the Bell system in 1984. And that was a great job because we got to build a whole new corporation, because all the old baby Bells used to do a lot of the accounting work and the engineering work for AT&T. But we got to get in down on the ground floor, and do all of this stuff. And I was an area operations manager in the external affairs department, and I had Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Utah, and I got to travel extensively in those states. And the headquarters, I was in the western area, and that was located in San Francisco, so I got to go out there quite frequently also. But it was great because I got to meet a lot of people, a lot of good independent telephone company people that really knew the business. I got to work with the Public Utilities Commission and the FCC, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was very enjoyable, and I made my mind years ago that when I was 60 years old, that was it. I was going to retire. So the company made me an offer when I was 59 and a half that I couldn't turn down, so I took it, and I've been retired since the end of February 1987. When I came to Denver, I went to the University of Colorado. Actually, when I went to the University of Colorado, it was the Denver Center downtown. And one of the reasons I went there is I worked in a phone company, which was a block away. And, I could get off of work and slip over and pick up a couple of hours. And it was business, strictly business. And then when I finished that, I went to the University of Northern Colorado, but I didn't go on campus. They had a place out at Lowry Air Force where the Air Force Academy first started, years ago. They still had those barracks, and what they would do is on weekends they would send the profs down. They would come down, and we would have classes from, from noon on Friday until 8 o'clock, or from 1 until 8. Then we'd go all day Saturday, and we'd go half a day on Sunday, and then we'd be off the next weekend, and we'd repeat that the following weekend. We get 40 hours of classwork. And that was really quite interesting because the people on the master's program there were all businessmen from the Denver area. They were colonels from the Air Force, and these types of people that had been in business, and I had been in management for Mountain Bell Telephone for a number of years. So it was very interesting because we had things that we could talk about that were actual, rather than something you got out of a textbook. And I think we all did quite well in there. And so I got a Master of Science in Business Administration from University of Northern Colorado. But the GI Bill got me started. If it wasn't for that, I probably would, I'd just been a high school graduate. Not only that, but I bought my first house. I lived just a couple blocks from here when I first came to Broomfield, and I got a nice GI loan, 5%, and that was another one of the benefits. I came to Broomfield in March of 1960, so I've been here a long time. I've lived in this house for 34 years. Well, there was a sign down on Midway that said population 6,000, and I'm sure we 40,000 now, or close to that, I imagine. But now it's kind of tough. Sometimes I have to sit for 2 or 3 minutes to back out of my driveway. There's so many people with the kids going to high school and and all that sort of stuff. But it's a nice area. All my friends are here now, and I have a sister that lives in Pueblo, and I can get down there in a couple hours, and a brother that lives in Monte Vista over in the San Luis Valley. So we're all here pretty much, within driving distance of each other. And my son lives in Lafayette. It was really a lot different. I can remember David was growing up and going to school, and he was all over like most kids are. And I was working downtown for Mount Bell Telephone, and I can remember we had a ride pool. There were several people from out here. Stan Wilson, he was here. I can't remember all the guys, but we would take turns every week, and we'd assign 1 week to each other, and we would have a ride pool going down. And I can remember one of the fellas, I can't remember his last name now. His name was Wally, but we just hated it when he drove in the wintertime because he had an old station wagon that didn't have a rear window in it. And he just, for some reason, would not put a window in there, and we would just freeze to death going down. It was just a nice little bedroom community in those days. We didn't have all of this business. We didn't have the flat irons and all of this stuff like we have today. And there are just a lot of people out here today. But there are still a few of us old-timers left. And it's kind of nice. This is home. I have a funeral plan, and I told my son, I says, when I'm gone, I'm going to Rundus, which is a couple blocks west, and then I got a plot over at the cemetery across from the high school, and so I'm going to stay in the neighborhood even after I'm gone. That's how much I think of Broomfield. Well, I'll tell you what, I love it. I think it's the greatest things in sliced bread, really. And I'm not much of a Boulder fan. I get really irritated with some of those people up there at times. And you ought to, if you really want to see how people feel, you ought to join us some Saturday morning at our Saturday morning breakfast up at Papa Frank's. And we've got a lot of we solve most of the problems in the world, and also in Broomfield up there every Saturday morning. But I think it's a good thing. I think we're big enough, and I think we need to kind of get out on our own. This is a big area. In fact, my son yesterday was telling me that they're working on a new golf course over by Highway 7. We've got more golf courses out here now, and boy, but that's great, And I think it's good that we're going to be our own. I just hope that we can make everything turn out the way it should. I got to know Vic Bocard, and he and I we became close friends, and Don Bolich was my dentist for many years, and Phil Bissell, I'm sure you probably know Phil. He and I are old buddies from way back, and Chuck Shield and I worked in a phone company together. Vic Bocard, of course, he was in the Marine Corps. Phil Bissell, he was a captain in the Army over in Europe, and I was in the Navy, and then I think Chuck Shield, he was not in during World War II, but he was in the Air Force, I think. And I don't think any of the other fellows, Don Bolich wasn't. Of course, they were a lot younger. There wasn't anything going on, when they were old enough to get into that stuff. But we talk quite a bit about those kinds of things, but it's in a joking manner. I know I like to kid Vic Bocard because one of the things I did when I was coming back for discharge, I was board ship, and I was a second-class petty officer, and I had a detachment of Marines that were chipping paint. And in the Navy, when you leave San Francisco and you go to somewhere you chip the paint, chip all the paint on the ship. And when the next crew comes on going back, you paint it, and then you chip it, and then you paint it. I mean, it's just kind of an ongoing thing. I'm not sure if they do the entire ship or everything, but anyway, I had a detachment of Marines were chipping paint on the ship, and that was kind of fun. I like to rub that into Vic, and I'd tell him, those guys are nothing but a bunch of, seagoing bellhops anyway, and he kind of smiles and takes it with a grain of salt, but it's a lot of fun. I'm the old grouch of the bunch, I guess, because I keep telling him, Vic brings down all the magazines. He gets a stack of magazines and papers, and he brings them down and distributes them to everybody, And I said, well, gee, Vic, you're giving this to me. All I'm going to do is take it home and stick it in my trash can. And I said, what is this, a way that you get rid of your trash every Saturday morning? And then he'll write his column, for the Enterprise, and he brings it down, and we'll all scrutinize it and tear it apart for him and everything. And then they have other things, being in the Rotary, Vic's in the Rotary, and Don Bolich is in it, Bill Humphrey's in it, and they have a lot of things the Rotary's doing, and they'll come down and they'll want, input for those kinds of things. And we'll talk about the school district and the problems we're having in the school and the problems in Broomfield. We talk about a lot of the local issues. Nothing ever comes of them, but, we kick those things around. And politics, we beat that to death every weekend. But it's pretty interesting. But I keep telling them, the only reason I come over here is I come over for the camaraderie, and I like to talk about the Broncos and the Rockies and the Avalanche. And here you guys, all you want to talk about is the Democrats and Republicans and the school board and, and all of this. And Boulder, they're all upset because we got all of these Democrats from Boulder on the school board, and all of this sort of stuff. And it's quite interesting. We get a lot done, and it's a good group. And occasionally we have somebody else come in. We have a little fellow, he's an Armenian from Boston. His name is Aram Paragamian. He's a little short guy, and we have something in common because he went to college down at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. And he, when he was going there, he roomed with several of the fellows that I went to high school with. So we have kind of a little tie there. But coming from, I might also add that he was a recruiter for Tom Osborne at the University of Nebraska. And Aaron played football down at Colorado College. But anyway, once in a while he'll bring somebody in. He brought a pitcher that was, I can't remember his name now, but he pitched for the Boston Red Sox, He brought him down, and it was really nice. It was nice to chat with him. And then another fellow, I think Joe Cullinane. Joe's got baseball stories that just won't stop. And we get people like that occasionally that join us, and it's kind of fun. And it's just something, it started years ago. Vic Bocard and I used to play golf on Saturdays, and we'd go out whether it was warm or cold or what it was. But if it was cold, we would go and have breakfast together. And I don't really remember the, what the heck was it? It was a restaurant over at the old shopping center. And I can't remember the name of it now, but we would go there and have breakfast. And then pretty soon one of the other guys would join us, and then pretty soon somebody else, and pretty soon there were 5 or 6 of us. And then, all of those places closed down, and then we went up to Papa Frank's one day, and it's really nice. They just open it up. We got a big table, and we sit down, and if we got too many, we pull another table up, and we could kid around with them, and everything. And we get together every Saturday morning, come rain or shine, and that's the way that kind of started. Vic and I kind of started that years ago, but it's a lot of fun. And, it gives us something to do, and as far as I'm concerned, I enjoy being around my friends, but, once a week's enough. I don't have to see them every day of the week. And then, during the football season, we usually get together here and we go downstairs and we watch Monday Night Football. And a lot of times we go to the Broncos games together. I have 4 season tickets, and, we'll get together and go. And then I think Vic used to have tickets, but we'll go down maybe once or twice a year, do that. And then we used to have Rockies season tickets, and I gave those up this year because I haven't been going to games. And we used to go to the Rockies games and, these kinds of things. And it's a real tight friendship. It's something that has grown over the years, and I wouldn't swap it for anything. You're only as good as your friends, I've always been in good health, and I played football in high school, we were the 1944 state champions in the state of Colorado, and then I played a little football at junior college when I was down at Pueblo. And I don't know, I've always liked those kinds of activities. And then I started playing golf, and I've been playing golf for 50 years, and I'm not any better today than I was 50 years ago. But it's a lot of fun. It's one thing you can play, you can have one foot in the grave and you can still go out and play golf. I just had back surgery last year, so but doctor just released me and told me I can go out and play golf and do just anything I feel like doing. So I feel pretty good now. Well, I have just one son, David, and he lives over in Lafayette. He's 44 years old, and he has his own business. He's a webmaster, and he does advertising on the internet. So it was interesting when you were talking about the cost of all of this equipment. Man, you ought to see some of that, that stuff that he has to pay for every month just to be on the internet. And my wife, my ex-wife, we were divorced a number of years ago, and she lives in Franktown, and she was a vice president for the Oppenheimer Management Company when she retired a few years ago. Other than that, I have a sister that lives in Pueblo and a brother that lives in Monte Vista, and that's the extent of it. I'm not much of a joiner. Our company used to want people to be involved in everything, but I'm kind of, I don't know, I kind of rather be in the background than in the foreground on most things. And when I was working, I got involved in a lot of things. I was part of the Boy Scout thing where we had to go around and do these kinds of interviews and stuff for them. And the United Fund, I kind of got stuck with that every year. And it was a lot of fun, but it kind of took away from really what you were trying to do. And I never did much in Broomfield. I was never approached to do anything. And I know it's kind of funny. On Saturday mornings, I'll be talking to Vic Bocard and Don Bolich, and they'll be talking about so-and-so, and I say, well, I don't know that person, and well, the person's been out here for 50 years, why don't you know him? And it's just that way, I know the people down the street and next door, and the few friends I have, but I don't know many people over on the other side of town. I guess I just don't get around that much anymore. Well, I didn't know I had that much to say, to be just perfectly honest. Usually I don't. The only thing I do is gripe and grouch most of the time.